Okay, here's a quick review video for Chapter 7. If you're watching this, that means you are getting ready to take the Chapter 7 quiz. And just wanted to recap. We started at 7.2. We talked about graphing rational functions. Okay, one's functions that have fractions in them. So we were using a Word doc, and we put a screenshot. We put 1 over x, 2 over x, 9 over x, 4 over x. We put them all in the same graph. Negative, you can see how negative flipped it over to the other quadrants. But you can see that it's going to be a curve on two different quadrants. There's areas where the graphs do not intersect. Those are imaginary lines that the graph can never touch because they're not allowed. Like on this first one, you can't have it be 0. You can't have x be 0. If you look at this, zoom in a little bit, your x is 0, x is at the bottom. If you put a 1 over 0, that's not allowed. So for 0 here, the graph would never touch that. It'll get really close, but it'll never touch. So there are areas where you can't touch, and those are called asymptotes. And those are parts of the graph. We graphed them. Okay, so after we drew our graph, then we zoomed in and we zoomed out to see where the dotted lines would be on our graph. You can go back to your video if you need to for 7.2, but this is the graph where the horizontal line, okay, that was what y cannot be, and this is the vertical line, what x cannot be. And we know that x cannot be 0 because you have a 0 on the bottom here. You would have a 0 on the bottom, and that's not allowed. We know y can't be -1 because this fraction right here has a 5 on top, and it doesn't have a 0 on top. So this fraction will never equal 0. 0 minus 1 would be -1, so it'll never be -1. So that's a horizontal asymptote where y could not be 0. Y. So those are just some fun. Even when they got moved over, you can see some of these other ones down here, like it moved over 3 to the left because it's a +3 at the bottom. Okay, and it moved one up here, but that was your vertical asymptote. That was what x cannot be. X cannot be -3, and then y cannot be a 1. So just little different things that were on the graph. So asymptotes are little lines, imaginary lines where the graphs can never touch. So that was 7.2. We were graphing those. We were also looking at domain and range. Domain is what the x numbers could be, and the range is what the y numbers could be. Normally, there was one number that they can't be, like it can't be 0 because x can't have a 0 on the bottom. This one, the x cannot be -4. So all real numbers except -4. So that's domain and range. Then we moved down into 7.3, and we moved into just simplifying rational expressions, and we have to factor to do that. So you've got to reduce as much as you can. You've got to see if you can factor. And this one, I had to take out a GCF, which was x. So I took an x out, and I took an x out of both of these. So if I take an x out, I'm only going to have 5x left. If I take an x out of that one, I'm only going to have a 2 left. And then the x's will cancel out. So you're left with 3x because one of the x's on top canceled out. So you would still have a 3x on top, and then the 5x plus 2 on the bottom. Some of them you have to factor a trinomial. We had to go back and relearn how to factor with an x and cross out the same parentheses on top and bottom. So you can go back and check any of those videos out. That's just simplifying. Then we had to multiply. So multiplying, we cross-canceled. Okay, we looked for something that was on the bottom and the top, and we crossed it out. Normally, we had to factor. So like this trinomial, I broke it down into x minus 3 and x minus 3, x minus 2. There was an x minus 2 on the bottom over here. So the x minus 2 cancels with the x minus 2. You would still have an x plus 3 and an x minus 3 on top, and you'd still have it's like a 4 on the bottom, but they might have canceled it over here. But that would be how you'd factor, and then you would try to cross cancel. And then quotient means division, and division means you are going to multiply, but you're going to flip it the second one around. So 6x squared is going to go on top. X minus 3 is going to go on the bottom. Okay, so we're flipping them around. Multiply by the reciprocal when you do division. So you're changing it to a multiplication problem and you're flipping the last one. If there's no fraction, just put a 1 under it, and now you can make it a fraction and you can flip it over. But again, there's a video you can watch back for those if you need to. 7.4, we were adding and subtracting them, but to do that, we had to find a common denominator. The first three were nice. They gave us common denominators. And then they asked us how to find a common denominator. So if you want to go back and check that out, we just needed to find out, what each one can go into. And then we would do the addition and subtraction. We would make them common denominators. And I did those 4 of them for you. So that was getting common denominators and adding or subtracting. Subtracting, you had to distribute the negative sign, so be careful on that. And then the last section we just covered yesterday was the solving. So the reason they wanted you to do the second 7.4 and learn how to get a common denominator is because that's how you actually will solve them. First off, if it's fraction equaling a fraction, you're going to just cross multiply. If it's a fraction equaling a fraction, just cross multiply. But when you've got rational equation, you got to find something that will eliminate all the denominators. So this first one, you're going to need to multiply all of them by x minus 2. The second one, you're going to need an x. The third one is also an x, so you don't need 2 of them. So that denominator would wipe out all of your fractions. So like in 7 and 8, we had a 3 and an x for my 2 denominators. So I need the 3 to wipe out this one. I need the x to wipe out the second one. But I've got to multiply everything by the 3x. You can't just do 2 things and leave the last one because it won't stay equal. Here I needed the x minus 3 to wipe out this bottom. There was no denominator on the second one. And here I needed the x to wipe out the second, the last fraction. So you can cross out what you can cross out, multiply what's left over, and this is what you get. So it's all on yesterday's video if you want to check those out. That's just a little rough recap of chapter 7.